The first piece of corrugated steel was a beast of a thing, 16 feet long and 3 feet wide, its edges sharp enough to slice through a canvas glove. Elias dragged it from the flatbed truck, the metal screeching against the gravel of the access road he'd spent 2 weeks carving into the hillside. He was 21 years old, lean and hard from a life of work that had started too early, and his hands were already a roadmap of scars and calluses. Beside him, a scruffy dog with the mismatched ears of a herder and the patient eyes of a philosopher watched the struggle. The dog, Barrow, did not bark or whine. He simply sat, his tail a metronome against the dry dirt, a silent, four-legged witness to the monumental foolishness unfolding before him. The destination was 100 yards up the slope, a dark, yawning mouth in the limestone cliff face, an opening 40 feet wide and nearly as tall at its peak. It was a geological anomaly, a south-facing alcove scoured out by some ancient, forgotten river. This was where he would build his home, not in front of it, inside it. He got the first panel to the cave entrance after an hour of grunting, leveraging, and sweating, despite the crisp, late autumn air that carried the scent of pine and impending frost. He leaned it against the rock wall, the galvanized steel looking alien and obscene against the ancient weathered stone. He ran a hand over his face, leaving a streak of grime on his cheek, and looked at his companion. "One down," Elias said, his voice quiet, rough from disuse. Barrow thumped his tail twice, then sneezed. It was this activity that drew his neighbor. Mr. Abernathy's truck appeared at the bottom of the new road, a plume of dust in its wake. The old rancher, a man whose face was as creased and unforgiving as the land he worked, climbed out and surveyed the scene. He pushed his hat back, spat a stream of tobacco juice, and squinted at the single piece of steel. "That's a Quonset kit," Abernathy stated, his voice a gravelly rumble. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded, taking a long drink from his canteen. "Yes, sir." Abernathy walked closer, his boots crunching on the loose rock. He peered into the dark maw of the cave, then back at the gleaming panel. A slow, disbelieving chuckle started in his chest. "You're not thinking of putting that thing in there?" "I am," Elias said. The chuckle became a full, throaty laugh. "Son, that's the craziest thing I've seen in 60 years of living in this valley. What in God's name for? You'll get damp, you'll get rock falls, you'll get every bat and pack rat from here to the county line moving in with you. Why not just build it on that level patch down by the creek like a normal person?" Elias looked at the cave, then back at the old man. He thought of his grandfather's journal, the one he'd read by lamplight every night for a month since the funeral. It was filled with crabbed handwriting, geological surveys, and temperature logs taken over 30 years. Notes on thermal mass, on the Earth's insulating properties, on the way this specific limestone formation held the memory of summer warmth deep into January. He could explain it all, but he knew it would be useless. The words would sound like madness. So he chose the ones that mattered. "This is better." "Better?" Abernathy scoffed, shaking his head. "Wait until the first big snow. That north wind whips around this ridge like a razor. The drift will fill that mouth right to the top. How you plan on getting out? You'll be buried alive in your own tomb." He gestured with a thumb back toward the valley. "You're a fool, Elias. Your grandfather, he was a smart man, a practical man. He'd think you've gone soft in the head." Elias didn't flinch. He just picked up his gloves. "I have a plan." "A plan?" Abernathy repeated, the words dripping with derision. He turned and walked back to his truck, still shaking his head. "A plan? Well,
Don't come crying to me when you're eating rats to stay alive come February.
The truck door slammed, and a moment later it was gone. Elias watched the dust settle. He looked at Barrow, who had risen to his feet and was now leaning his solid weight against Elias's leg. The dog looked up, his intelligent eyes seeming to ask a question. Elias reached down and scratched behind the mismatched ears. "He's wrong," he said quietly. "The book says he's wrong." He turned back to the flatbed. There were 47 more panels to move. The sun was already beginning its slow descent behind the western peaks, and the air was getting colder. The work was just beginning. The days bled into weeks. The rhythm of his life became the rhythm of the work. Wake at dawn, the air sharp and metallic in his lungs. Coffee boiled over a small fire. Then, the hauling. Each steel panel was a battle against gravity and leverage. His shoulders ached, his back screamed, and his hands, even through thick leather, were a geography of new cuts and blisters. Barrow was his shadow, a constant, silent presence. The dog would lie in a patch of sun just outside the cave, watching, occasionally trotting over to nudge Elias's hand with his wet nose, a quiet reminder to drink water, to rest. Community is a small thing in a place like this, a web of observation and conversation that travels faster than a truck on a gravel road. His project became the talk of the town of Reconciliation, a settlement of 400 souls nestled in the valley below. When he went to Gable's general store for supplies, cement mix, rebar, bolts, canned food, the whispers followed him down the aisles. Mrs. Gable, a woman with a kind heart and a perpetually worried expression, would pat his arm as she totaled his purchases. "Elias, dear," she'd say, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Mr. Sterling was in here yesterday. He said you were digging up on the old Cliff property. He's on the town council, you know. He called it an unapproved modification to the landscape." "It's my land," Elias said, counting out the $17 for the sacks of concrete. "Of course, dear, of course. But people are talking. They're worried. That cave, it isn't a place for a person to live. It's cold. It's damp." "It'll be warm," he said. Her expression softened with pity. "Oh, honey, you'll freeze in that damp old hole. There's still time to put that building up properly, out in the sun." He just nodded, hoisted the heavy sacks onto his shoulder, and left. He didn't have the words to fight, and he didn't have the inclination. The proof wasn't in talking. It was in the concrete he was about to mix. He built the forms for the foundation first, a rectangle of wood 40 feet long and 24 feet wide, set 12 feet back from the cave opening. He leveled the ground inside it by hand, with a shovel and a tamper, his breath pluming in the increasingly cold air of the cave's interior. The air temperature inside the rock was a constant 52 degrees Fahrenheit, just as his grandfather's journal had promised. It felt cool now, in the autumn, but he knew what it would feel like when the outside world was 10 below zero. It would feel like life. He mixed the concrete in a wheelbarrow, sack by sack, 64 sacks in total. The work was brutal, a relentless cycle of pouring, mixing, hauling, and smoothing. His body became a machine fueled by coffee and canned beans. At night, he'd collapse in his tent pitched near the cave, too tired to dream, while Barrow slept curled against his back, a warm, living anchor in the cold darkness. One afternoon, as he was setting the last of the anchor bolts into the wet concrete, a different visitor appeared. A young woman with dark hair tied back and a dusting of flour on her cheek. It was Alara, the town librarian. She carried a small basket. "I was baking," she said, her voice softer than the whispers in the store. "I made too much. Thought you might be hungry." Elias straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants. He felt a flush of awkwardness. He hadn't spoken to anyone but Mrs. Gable and Mr. Abernathy in over a month. "Thank you." She stepped past the edge of the foundation, her eyes taking in the scale of the work, the neat stacks of steel panels, the meticulously leveled concrete slab. She wasn't looking at it with pity or mockery. She looked at it with genuine curiosity. "I heard what you were doing," she said. "No one else seemed to understand it. But then I saw the books you checked out." She ticked them off on her fingers. Principles of Geothermal Exchange, Subterranean Structures and Thermal Regulation, A Surveyor's Guide to North American Rock Formations. He felt his face grow warm. "My grandfather's books." "He was a smart man," she said, echoing Abernathy's words but with a completely different meaning. She looked around the vast stone chamber. He knew about this place, didn't he? He knew it held the heat. Elias just nodded, unsure what to say. She smiled, a small, genuine thing. I think this is brilliant." She set the basket down on a flat rock. Inside was a loaf of fresh bread, still warm, and a jar of apple butter. "My father was a builder. He always said the smartest design works with the land, not against it." They ate in silence for a few minutes, tearing off pieces of the warm bread. Barrow sat at Elias's feet, gratefully accepting the small bites his master offered him. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. It was the first time he hadn't felt entirely alone in his conviction. "They think I'm crazy," Elias said, the statement flat, without self-pity. "Every good idea seems crazy at first," Ilara replied, looking at the smooth, gray foundation. "Right up until the moment it works." When she left, the silence that returned to the cave felt different. It was less the silence of isolation and more the silence of focused purpose. Her belief, a single quiet voice against the chorus of doubt, was like a brace on a weak wall. It firmed his resolve. The concrete cured. The first frost came, painting the valley floor in a sheet of brilliant white. The air grew teeth. Now the real construction could begin. He rented a small scissor lift, a clunky diesel-powered machine that he painstakingly drove up his makeshift road. Raising the first arch was a delicate and terrifying operation. He and the machine, alone in the vast quiet of the cave. He'd lift a curved panel, guide it into place, and then, perched 20 feet in the air, wrestle it into alignment with the bolts in the foundation. He'd tighten the nuts by hand, his muscles straining, the cold steel biting at his fingertips through his gloves. Each arch was composed of 5 sections. He assembled them on the ground, then lifted the entire arch into place. It was a slow, painstaking process. 1 arch a day, if he was lucky. As the structure took shape, a skeleton of steel ribs under the stone roof of the cave, the comments from the valley grew more pointed. Mr. Sterling, the town's wealthiest man and owner of the lumber mill, drove up one Saturday in his gleaming new Ford. He didn't get out of the vehicle. He simply rolled down the window, his face a mask of condescending disapproval. "Elias," he called out, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. "I've had 3 complaints this week about this project. It's an eyesore from the main road. What do you intend to do with this metallic monstrosity?" Elias was on the lift, wrench in hand. He looked down at the man. "Live in it." Sterling laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Live in it? Son, my barns are better insulated than that tin can. You'll be an icicle by Christmas. This is a foolish waste of good land. I'll give you $500 for this parcel right now, cash. save you the trouble of freezing to death, and let you start over somewhere sensible."
"No, thank you, Mr. Sterling. This is my home."
The words felt solid, true. He had spoken them into existence. "Suit yourself," Sterling sneered. "But when the town has to foot the bill for the sheriff to come up here and recover your frost-bitten corpse, don't say I didn't warn you." He rolled up his window and drove away. Elias watched him go. He looked at the half-finished structure, its graceful steel curves contrasting with the jagged rock. He felt a surge of something cold and hard in his gut. It wasn't anger, it was determination. He turned back to his work, the rhythmic tightening of the wrench a prayer against their doubt. By mid-November, all 17 arches were up. The Quonset hut stood within the cave, a tunnel within a tunnel. Now came the work of enclosing it. He started with the back wall, cutting and fitting the steel panels, sealing every seam with a thick tar-like mastic. Then came the front. This was the most complex part of the design, the part his grandfather's journal had sketched out in the most detail. He framed a wall 12 feet back from the front arch, leaving a sort of Arctic entryway, a buffer zone between the interior and the cave mouth. He used thick timber for the framing and sheathed it with steel, but on the inside he began the laborious process of insulating it. He used reclaimed sheep's wool insulation, dense, fire-resistant bats that he had to order from 3 counties away. He packed it into the stud bays, a full 12 inches thick. He built a heavy, insulated door, fitting it with 3 sets of hinges to bear its weight, and weather-stripping it until it was airtight. He installed a single, triple-paned window next to it, facing out toward the valley. It was the structure's only eye to the outside world. The final piece of the puzzle was the stove. It was a small, brutally efficient cast-iron box stove designed for heating workshops. Its genius was in the flue. Instead of venting it straight up, he ran the stovepipe horizontally along the interior peak of the hut, a full 35 feet, before it exited through the rear wall. This long run would allow the maximum amount of heat to radiate into the living space before escaping. The flue pipe itself then passed through a custom-made thimble in the steel wall and ran another 20 feet into a natural crevice deep in the back of the cave, a fissure that his grandfather's notes confirmed vented out high on the cliff face. It was a natural chimney, one that would draw perfectly in any wind. He spent a week splitting and stacking wood, filling the space between the Quonset and the cave wall with cords of seasoned pine and oak. It was his fuel, his life insurance. The stacks grew into small walls of their own, adding yet another layer of insulation. The first time he lit the stove, the air was heavy with the smell of curing paint and hot metal. Barrow, who had been shivering slightly in the 52-degree air, moved closer to the cast-iron box, sighing as the first waves of warmth washed over him. Elias sat on an upturned bucket, watching the flames dance behind the small glass door. He placed a thermometer on a nail driven into the framing. Within an hour, the temperature inside the hut had climbed from 52 to 68 degrees. He fed a single small log into the stove and damped it down. The temperature held steady. It was working. The first snow came on the first day of December. It was a gentle affair, a dusting that turned the valley into a Christmas card. Abernathy drove by again, slowing his truck but not stopping. He just shook his head and kept going. The general consensus in town was that the first real cold snap would drive the boy out of his rock pile and back to civilization. The cold snap arrived a week later. A wave of Arctic air plunged down from Canada, pushing the nighttime temperatures to 5 below zero. The wind howled. Elias woke in the dark, snug in his sleeping bag. Barrow was a warm lump at his feet. The stove was banking a low, steady heat. He got up and checked the thermometer. It read 66 degrees. He pulled on his boots and coat and opened the heavy door. He stepped into the Arctic entryway, the buffer zone. The air here was cooler, maybe 45 degrees. He then walked the 12 feet to the mouth of the cave. The world outside was a different planet. The wind was a physical force, trying to tear the breath from his lungs. The cold was so intense, it felt like a burn. He looked at an outdoor thermometer he'd hung on a pine tree. It read 7 degrees below zero, a 73-degree difference between his sleeping bag and the outside world. He stepped back into the shelter of the cave, the wind's roar diminishing to a distant moan. He closed the insulated door to his home, the sound sealing him into his bubble of warmth and quiet. He fed another log into the stove. It would work. The real test, however, was yet to come. The old-timers felt it in their bones. The animals knew it. The deer came down from the high country earlier than usual. The squirrels were frantic, burying pine cones with a desperate energy. The sky had a strange, milky yellow cast to it for days. Abernathy stopped by, this time getting out of his truck. He didn't look at the Quonset. He looked at the sky. "It's a bad one, son," he said, his earlier mockery gone, replaced by a grim seriousness. "My grandfather saw a sky like this once, back in '88. The White Hurricane, they called it. Buried houses to the eaves, killed half the cattle in the valley. Whatever you're doing in there, you best be ready." "I'm ready," Elias said. "You got enough wood?" "I think so." "And food?" Elias nodded. "Enough for a month." Abernathy grunted, a sound of grudging respect. "Well, good luck to you then." He climbed back into his truck, but before he drove off, he paused. "That dog of yours, he's got good sense. If he looks worried, you should be too." That night, Barrow was restless. He paced the length of the hut, whining softly, his ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. The wind died down completely, creating an unnerving, profound silence. The air pressure dropped so suddenly that Elias felt it in his sinuses. Then, just after midnight, the first flakes began to fall. They were not the gentle flakes of the season's first snow. They were small and hard, like pellets of sand, driven by a rising wind. By dawn, the world was gone. There was no valley, no trees, no sky. There was only a churning, horizontal torrent of white. The wind didn't howl, it shrieked, a high, constant, tearing sound that vibrated through the rock itself. Elias looked out his small window and could see nothing but a solid, moving wall of snow. He went to the cave mouth. The wind was a monster, piling snow into the entrance at an alarming rate. Abernathy's prediction was coming true. The drift was rising. He spent the morning tending the stove, organizing his supplies, listening to the storm. The temperature outside, according to the radio weather report, had plummeted to 25 below zero, with wind chills approaching 70 below. The governor had declared a state of emergency. All roads were closed. Power lines were down across the state. Reconciliation was cut off. Inside his insulated shell, it was 67 degrees. The stovepipe radiated a gentle, consistent heat. Barrow, his earlier anxiety gone now that the storm had fully arrived, slept soundly by the fire. The roar of the wind was a dull, distant rumble, the sound of a faraway ocean. He had food. He had water, from 5-gallon jugs he'd filled. He had warmth. He was safe. The snow continued to pile up. By the second day, the drift had completely sealed the lower half of the cave entrance. By the third day, the light coming into the cave mouth was gone. It was a wall of white, floor to ceiling. They were buried. Abernathy had been right about that. But he had been wrong about what it meant. It wasn't a tomb. It was insulation. The tons of snow now blocking the entrance were a perfect windbreak, trapping the stable 52-degree air of the cave in the space in front of his hut. His Arctic entryway was now the entire front portion of the cave. On the evening of the third day, he heard a new sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a faint, frantic scratching, followed by a muffled thump against the snow wall at the cave's mouth. Barrow shot to his feet, a low growl in his throat. Elias quieted him with a hand. "Easy, boy." He listened. The scratching came again, weaker this time. Someone was out there. He pulled on his coat, grabbed a shovel and a lantern, and opened his door. The air in the main cave area was still and cold, but not brutally so. He made his way to the wall of snow and listened. He could hear a faint, desperate sound, a voice, but the words were lost. He started digging. The snow was incredibly dense, packed by the wind into a substance closer to ice than powder. It was like digging through concrete. He worked for an hour, sweat freezing on his forehead, his arms burning. Finally, his shovel broke through into a small pocket of air. A face appeared in the hole, rimmed with ice, eyes wide with terror and disbelief. It was Abernathy. Behind him, Elias could see the shapes of two other people, his wife and his young grandson. "Elias," the old man rasped, his voice raw. "My God, you're alive." "Get in," Elias said simply. He widened the hole and they stumbled through, collapsing on the cave floor, shivering violently. Mrs. Abernathy was weeping silently, clutching the boy, who was wrapped in a horse blanket but still shaking uncontrollably. Abernathy's hands were blue. "The roof on our porch collapsed," the old man said, his teeth chattering. "Took out the main wall. The house, it's full of snow. We lost the fire. Been in the truck for a day. Ran out of gas this morning. I thought we were dead. I aimed for the cliff. It was the only landmark I could guess at." Elias didn't say anything. He led them through the Arctic entryway into the hut. The wave of warmth hit them like a physical blow. Mrs. Abernathy gasped. The boys stopped shivering and just stared at the stove, his eyes huge. Elias handed them blankets and put a kettle of water on to boil for tea. Abernathy stood in the middle of the room, slowly turning, looking at the insulated walls, the warm stovepipe running the length of the ceiling, the neat stacks of food. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, 68 degrees. He looked back at Elias, and for the first time, Elias saw the old man's armor of pride and certainty crack completely. His eyes filled with tears. "I called you a fool," Abernathy said, his voice thick with shame. "I laughed at you." Elias just handed him a steaming mug of tea. "Drink this. You're safe now." They were the first. They were not the last. Over the next 2 days, as the storm raged on, others found their way to the cave. It became a beacon of impossible survival. The Sterling family, their massive modern house's generator having failed, arrived on the 4th day, guided by the faint plume of smoke from the hidden chimney flue, which was the only thing visible for miles. Mr. Sterling, his expensive parka torn and his face frost-nipped, looked as humbled as Abernathy. He didn't offer to buy the land. He just asked, his voice shaking, if there was room. "There's always room," Elias said. Mrs. Gable and her husband arrived last, having been rescued from their collapsed store by Sterling's foreman. By the time the storm finally broke on the 5th day, there were 17 people sheltered in and around the Quonset hut. The interior was crowded, but the overflow of people slept in the main cave area, which, protected from the wind and warmed by the constant traffic and the radiant heat from the hut itself, held a steady and survivable 48 degrees. Elias's home had become an ark. When the sun finally emerged, the world it revealed was terrifying and beautiful. The valley was buried under 15 feet of snow. The tops of houses were barely visible. The silence was absolute. It took another week for outside help to arrive. In that week, the small group of survivors in the cave lived on Elias's supplies. They worked together, rationed food, and cared for one another. The social structures of the valley, the wealth of Sterling, the experience of Abernathy, the kindness of Mrs. Gable, were leveled. They were all just survivors, kept alive by the quiet boy they had ridiculed. The aftermath transformed reconciliation. The story of the cave Quonset became a local legend, a testament to unconventional wisdom. When the town rebuilt, it was with a new sense of humility before the power of nature. Mr. Sterling, using his own money, helped fund the expansion of Elias's project. They didn't build more huts. Instead, they helped Elias fully outfit the cave itself, installing a larger stove, building bunks along the walls, and creating a permanent, geothermally stable emergency shelter for the entire community, with Elias as its quiet, unassuming caretaker. Ilara had been out of town during the storm, visiting family, and returned to a town irrevocably changed. She found Elias not in a tomb, but at the center of a grateful community. Their friendship, forged in a shared belief in a crazy idea, deepened into a quiet, steadfast love. They were married the following spring, not in a church, but at the mouth of the cave, with the whole town in attendance. Years passed. The cave shelter was never needed on that scale again, but it served as a warming station for lost hunters and a safe place for livestock during lesser storms. The knowledge of its existence was a comfort, a security blanket for the entire valley. Elias and Ilara raised 2 children in a small, properly built house down by the creek, but the Quonset in the cave remained his workshop, his sanctuary, a place of quiet contemplation. He shared his grandfather's journals with anyone who asked, and the principles of working with the land, of using the earth's own insulation, began to appear in the new buildings that sprang up in the valley. Barrow grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his mismatched ears drooped a little lower, and his steps became slow and deliberate. But his eyes remained as intelligent and patient as ever. He spent his final years lying on a thick sheepskin rug by the stove in the Quonset, his favorite place in the world. One autumn afternoon, 16 years after he had watched his master haul the first piece of steel, he laid his head on his paws and went to sleep, and did not wake up. Elias buried him on the hillside overlooking the cave, beneath a tall pine tree. The small wooden marker read simply, "Barrow, he was a good witness." Elias himself lived a long and peaceful life. He never became a loud man, never boasted of what he had done. He simply lived, worked, and loved his family. He taught his children how to read the sky, how to listen to the land, and how to respect the quiet wisdom of their great-grandfather's journals. He became the new old-timer, the one people sought out for advice, which he gave in short, practical sentences. When he died at the age of 87, the entire valley mourned. They buried him next to Barrow, on the hill overlooking his life's work. Ilara, her own hair now the color of snow, had a simple stone carved for him. It didn't list his accomplishments or the lives he had saved. It just said, Elias Thorne. He had a plan. Long after everyone who had been there for the White Hurricane was gone, the structure remained. The Quonset hut still stands inside the mouth of the cave, its galvanized steel unrusted, its insulated walls sound. It is a monument, not to one man's ego, but to his quiet persistence. It is a testament to the enduring power of a good idea, an idea that seemed like madness to everyone right up until the moment it worked. It stands against the wind and the snow, a silent, curving shape in the darkness, forever 61 degrees warmer than the world outside.